Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm Annie Schaebel, the Intercept CEO. I'm very honored to welcome members of our board along with our readers and supporters to today's conversation, which we will be recording. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from Jeremy Scahill and Sharif Abdel Kouddous about the events unfolding in Gaza. Before I turn it over to them, I want to share a bit about the Intercept's reporting on Gaza. We stand apart in our rigorous reporting grounded in context. We're focusing on the US's role in the conflict. As journalists committed to free speech, we're also very concerned about the suppression of Palestinian dissent. And as humanitarians, we're dedicated to showing the impact of prioritizing military strategy over human rights. This is the kind of journalism you won't find anywhere else. In fact, The Intercept was founded to tell courageous stories that are missing from the mainstream media. And we're proud to be powered by donations from the public. We're in the midst of a year-end fundraising campaign. Thank you to those of you who have already supported. If you haven't, you can make a donation by visiting theintercept.com/Gaza. There's a link in the chat. That's theintercept.com/Gaza. And with that, I'm honored to introduce Jeremy and Sharif. Jeremy Scahill is an award-winning investigative reporter, war correspondent, and author of several international best-selling books, and is one of the co-founders of The Intercept. Sharif Abdel Kouddous is an independent journalist who has reported from inside Gaza. His work has appeared on Al Jazeera, Democracy Now!, and more. He's also a co-producer of the Palestine Festival of Literature. His George Polk award-winning documentary, The Killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, helped expose the White House's efforts to avoid a U.S. investigation after Shireen, a prominent Palestinian-American journalist, was shot dead by Israeli forces. Jeremy, Sharif, welcome.
Thank you, Annie. And just before we start talking about the war against Gaza, and I'm so honored to be joined by my longtime and dear friend, Sharif Abdel Kouddous, who is one of the most important independent journalists operating today. And both of us cut our teeth as journalists at Democracy Now! And we're also honored that Amy Goodman is on the session today watching us. She just texted me right before we went on. So hello, Amy, and thank you so much for all the incredible work that Democracy Now! Has done, not just in covering this war, but just in keeping us all sane. You know, many outlets, media outlets, are firing journalists or sanctioning journalists or warning them against speaking out about their views of the war against Gaza. And one of the things that I'm most proud of and that I value about The Intercept is that speaking out about war crimes, speaking out about the complicity of the United States government in wars around the world, that's part of our job. It's not something we get punished for or fired for or disciplined for. It's a central part of the kind of journalism that we do at The Intercept. And it's also a central part of the journalism that Sharif has now done for more than a decade. This is not a war that started on October 7th. And this is not a war against Hamas. This is a war that has been going on for 75 years. And we are now looking at a death toll that is surpassing the 1948 Nakba. We are talking about 26,000, by some estimates, Palestinians killed, more than 10,000 children. We're just passing now the 10,000 mark of documented cases of children being killed. This is not a war against Hamas. The vast majority of the people that have been killed have nothing to do with Hamas whatsoever. This is part of a concerted, directed campaign of annihilation against the Palestinian people, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank as well. I have started calling what is happening right now in Gaza a killing cage. They've converted what was an open-air prison that was blockaded, that was regularly bombed and attacked in operations that the Israeli military referred to as mowing the lawn, mowing the grass. They've converted that open-air prison into a killing cage that is shrinking by the moment. The Israeli military released a totally dystopian app on the website of the IDF, and it was a grid of Gaza that was broken into blocks. And they told Palestinians in Gaza that they needed to scan a QR code. These are people that overwhelmingly have no access to food or limited access to food. They have limited access to water. Their hospitals are being bombed. Their clinics are being bombed. Their medical workers are being killed. Their internet connection is being shut down, and they're told that to save your life in this dystopian Netflix show that Israel is imposing on them, download from the occupation forces website a QR code, and then it's going to bring up a map, and you need to follow our updates so that you can know when you need to move from this part of the grid to that part of the grid. That's the reality right now that is being faced by the Palestinians who have managed to survive the past 2 months of a scorched earth campaign. They are in an ever-shrinking killing cage that is not just being enforced by the Israeli government, which is a nuclear power that is waging a war against a people that have no regular army, no navy, no air force, no Marines, no Coast Guard, that is overwhelmingly a young country, a young population of people, and it is entirely being bankrolled, armed, and given political cover from the United States, the most powerful nation in the world. You know, a lot of people who wrote in questions said, why is Joe Biden doing this? Why isn't he stopping this? Well, if you've studied Joe Biden's career for the past 50 years, he's been in politics that long. For the past 50 years, one thing stands out about Joe Biden's record on Israel. He has been one of the most ardent defenders of Israel's worst crimes, going back to his earliest days in politics. In fact, there's one story that I think is so revealing about Joe Biden and his support for Israel. And it happens in the summer of 1982, when Menachem Begin is the prime minister of Israel. And Menachem Begin himself was one of the leaders of the Irgun militia that also committed war crimes in the 1940s against Palestinians. And Menachem Begin has just launched the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan, was actually expressing concern about the number of civilians that were being killed in Lebanon. Members of the United States Senate it's totally different than today, where people had to be dragged kicking and screaming, and some of them are still all in with Israel. Most of them are all in with Israel. But at that time in 1982, there were US senators who were very concerned about the slaughter that was taking place against civilians in Lebanon. And so Menachem Begin comes to Washington and he meets with these senators. And they're going after him about the killing of civilians. And Begin goes back to Israel and he talks to reporters. And he says, but there was one young senator who stood up and gave an impassioned speech and said that if he was in our position, he would do the same thing, including killing women and children. And that senator was Joe Biden. You can't pretend that Joe Biden is being sincere when he says he cares about Palestinian lives if you know anything about Joe Biden's history on Israel and Palestine. You know, Joe Biden, the White House urged Israel to protect civilians in Gaza on October 11th, on October 16th, on October 29th, on November 3rd, on November 10th, on November 29th, on December 6th, on December 12th, on December 14th, on December 17th. And yet, what have we looked at during all of those times when he was supposedly expressing concern about Palestinian lives? More weapons transfers. Antony Blinken a couple of weeks ago, the day that the United States stood alone in shame in front of the world and vetoed the ceasefire resolution at the United Nations, this extraordinary session of the UN Security Council, Antony Blinken was busy in Washington circumventing congressional review processes for weapons sales to push through 13,000 additional rounds of tank munitions to Israel. So all of those dates that I listed when the White House was supposedly urging Israel to protect civilians in Gaza, they were loading up the gun again so that they could kill more Palestinians. Words mean nothing when the actions contradict them. And this entire operation has been the White House pretending that it wants to have it both ways when its actions indicate that it only wants it one way. And that way is kill them all, burn Gaza to the ground, back up Benjamin Netanyahu's war of annihilation against the Palestinians. We are past the point where anyone should be pretending that this is a war against Hamas when you look at the death toll, when you look at the actions of Washington. I've said that Joe Biden could end this with a phone call, and I'm not saying that as a slogan. I'm saying it because in 2021, when the United States was backing Israel's bombing of Gaza, attacks against Gaza, Joe Biden called Netanyahu and basically said, okay, you've burned it enough, and it's time to wrap it up. And within 24 hours, Netanyahu was accepting that Egypt should play a role in a ceasefire and bringing that to an end. If Joe Biden wanted to protect Palestinian lives, he could make a phone call and say to Netanyahu, no more weapons shipments. No more weapons shipments. But he's not going to do that because that's not who he is, and it's not what the United States government has been for decades. Now, I was so honored that Sharif would join us because Sharif has reported on the ground from Gaza, and Sharif has been a tenacious advocate for Palestinian journalists under fire in Gaza and the West Bank for a long time. And he did a documentary for Al Jazeera that won the prestigious George Polk Award that focused on the assassination, yes, assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh, perhaps the most important television journalist that was reporting from Palestine. And she was an American citizen who was sniper shot on May 11th, 2022 in Jenin. Jenin, which is being laid siege to again as we speak by the Israelis. So Sharif, I want to thank you for joining us here. And let's begin by talking about the conditions that our colleagues on the ground in Gaza, almost every single one of them Palestinian, are facing. 95 or 96 journalists have been killed by Israel since the beginning of this war against Gaza. The Committee to Protect Journalists, which has a different method of calculating it, says that at least 64 journalists were killed. Regardless of what number we want to cite, this is an unprecedented killing of journalists, and it appears as though Israel wants not just the journalists dead, but their families as well, because there have been many strikes against the families of Palestinian journalists.
Right. I mean, first of all, thank you, Jeremy. It's an honor to be here and to be on with you and with the Intercept, which has done such important work, one of the few media outlets in the United States that's covering Palestine in the way that it should. Ever since the week-long truce where there was a prisoner swap ended just over the past 2 weeks, we've seen a horrific resumption of Israel's assault on Gaza and some of the most gruesome war crimes that we're only getting a glimpse of right now because of how difficult it is to report in Gaza and because Israel has killed so many journalists in Gaza. This is not a big place, and you're talking about almost 100 journalists being killed. One of the most horrifying incidents came just several days ago when Israeli forces bulldozed tents housing displaced and wounded Palestinians near the Kamal Adwan hospital in Beit Lahia. It literally ran over wounded and displaced Palestinians with a bulldozer, crushing them to death or burying them alive. And this was after the hospital was besieged and shelled for days. And when staff tried to hold a small press conference outside the hospital, they were fired on. This should be front page headline story around the globe. And we're only getting snippets of what actually happened because there's so few journalists left to cover incidents like this one, because journalists are being deliberately targeted by the Israeli military. There are families right now inside the Holy Family church complex in Gaza City. They've been there for 60 days where they sought shelter. They're trapped inside. Israeli forces have now taken the building opposite the church. There's now snipers at every window. There's guns pointing at the church. There's a tank also that's taken position outside. Anyone trying to move around is being shot at. They recently shot 2 women who were trying to get from one building to another in the church complex. We don't have enough coverage of this because of this sustained attack on journalists. I'm speaking to you from Cairo. I just came from an event where the Palestinian poet Mus'ab Abu Toha was giving a talk. He just got out of Gaza with his family, with his wife and 3 young children, one of whom was born in the United States and has American citizenship, and that was how he got out. He was detained for 30 hours as they were moving on south, even though his name was on a list. He's written for The New Yorker. He's an award-winning poet. And when he was asked about how he's coping with the situation, He said, we don't know the names of the people killed because there's no media coverage. He said he only learned 2 days ago that his beloved football coach was killed a couple of weeks ago. And he said he knows that in the coming days, he's going to learn of more names of people that he loves who are dead. And he can't even begin to mourn because he doesn't know what the losses are yet. And he said that sharing the stories of the people in Gaza is not just a sign of solidarity, it's a must. And sharing these stories is our duty as journalists. And I just want to talk about one journalist that I personally know in Gaza who was killed. Bilal Jadallah was someone I knew and that I worked with. He was a director of the Press House Palestine. He was a mentor to so many journalists in Gaza, and he was killed in an Israeli airstrike on his car on November 18th. Jadallah was my sponsor in Gaza when I went in 2014 to cover the war, which up until 2 months ago had been the deadliest Israeli assault on Gaza. And when you enter Gaza, if you're coming through, most people were going through Erez, the Israeli border point. When you get to the Palestinian side, border control, you need a Palestinian to sign you in to be your sponsor. And Bilal Jadallah was my sponsor. And he took me to the Press House Palestine and assigned me a young journalist to work with. People call them fixers. I don't really like that term. And there was just, he had just these teams of young journalists that he was assigning to foreign correspondents. He also sat with us, foreign correspondents, and held forth on the political and military situation in Palestine. He was seen as a father figure for so many journalists there. He also provided research for a report by the Committee to Protect Journalists that came out this past May called Deadly Pattern, that looked at the killings of journalists by the Israeli military going back 22 years. And the report found a pattern of Israeli response to the killings of journalists that is designed to evade responsibility. So this is not new. Israel has been killing journalists and doing so with impunity for so long. And that report, by the way, was published on the 1-year anniversary of the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, who was killed, as you mentioned, on May 11th, 2022. What's different now is that the unprecedented scale and speed of journalists being killed by Israel. Over 90 have been killed in just over 2 months. And many of the ones that have managed to survive have lost so much. They've lost their families, they've lost their homes, and yet they still somehow manage to summon the strength to keep reporting and to inform the world of what's actually happening in Gaza or what's happening to Gaza. And journalists all over the world, especially in Western newsrooms, should be outraged by this. They should repeatedly condemn in unequivocal terms this killing. There should be black banners on the newspapers in the West. They need to stand up and, not just for Palestinian journalists, but for all journalists, because if Israel can get away with this and kill so many journalists, then this sets a horrifying precedent for the world. And newsrooms have shown that they can be vocal and shown outrage over the killing of, for example, Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was brutally murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, or Evan Gershkovich, who was wrongfully detained and remains in prison in Russia. We've seen them speak out, but there's something akin to silence right now, and it's shameful, actually. And the other thing I think that we need, and this is just my last point, is that international journalists need to get into Gaza, okay? Egypt is not allowing journalists into Gaza, and Israel is only allowing them in, or did, on these brief, highly controlled tours that are embedded with the Israeli military that have produced terrible reporting. We need journalists to be able to get in through Rafah, Rafah is the only border crossing not controlled by Israel into Gaza. We need to get in to help tell the story of what's happening on the ground in this paradigm shifting moment, but more than anything, to support Palestinian journalists in Gaza and to shoulder some of their labor, because they're being killed at a scale that we have not seen in our lifetimes. And there have been dozens of foreign correspondents that have submitted requests to the press center here in Cairo, requesting access to Gaza through Rafah, and those requests have gone unanswered. And so Egypt is complicit in this international reporting blockade that Israel has imposed.
You know, Sharif, and also I saw today there are the Foreign Press Association in Israel has filed a suit that's making its way through the Israeli courts, trying to sue the Israeli government to allow access for journalists to cover the war in Gaza. But your point is a crucial one, also about the kinds of journalists then that would come from the Rafah side of it. I mean, it's you know, some newspapers have slogans like, you know, democracy dies in the dark. Well, that's what Israel is trying to do right now. And I agree with you. I think that these, you know, Democracy Now!, the Intercept, independent news organizations, we can scream our throats raw, yelling about the killing of our colleagues in Gaza. But if the most prominent and important news organizations in the world would show even a fraction of the outrage that they do in some of the cases that you've cited, then it elevates it to a totally different level. And it gives lie to all of the pronouncements that we see from the White House about respecting freedom of the press. And every time I watch Anthony Blinken or someone else, Samantha Power at a human rights event, you know, marking the anniversary of this or that, and then I look at the images coming out of Gaza, I feel a deep sense of shame, an incredible sense of shame. I wanted to also mention one other journalist, a colleague of ours, who, you know, I think should be viewed as one of the most heroic figures to emerge in these 2 months, and that's Wael Dawdoua, the bureau chief for Al Jazeera Arabic in Gaza. I'm sure many people know who he is because he's become very prominent for horrifying reasons. I mean, on the one hand, anyone in the Arabic language world right now knows his face and his reporting so well because he's been one of the few people that from the moment it began has just been there every single day. In late October, he's reporting on the massive bombardment of Gaza when he learns that his family has been killed in an Israeli airstrike. His wife, 2 of his 8 children, and his grandchild were all killed, and he had to report on their deaths as it was happening, as he was learning that his family members were killed. And the next day he was back at work because all he has is that. All he has is he is a reporter. He is a journalist. And they murdered his family. And you know, I've been paying so much attention to his reports, and you know, just, I don't know, 10 days ago or so, I saw this remarkable video that someone had posted on Instagram, and it was Wael sitting there with a 9-year-old girl, and the 9-year-old girl was an aspiring journalist, and she's interviewing Wael, and I described it as simultaneously heartbreaking and heartwarming, because this man, when you know who he is and you know the loss he suffered, an unspeakable loss of not just having his wife and his children killed, but then his grandson of the next generation killed. And the dignity, people should look up that video of him. You see his humanity, the way he spoke to this child. And he spoke at an age-appropriate level about the horrors that she was living through and that he was living through. And he talked about the steadfastness and the patience of the Palestinian people. And the day after I posted that video and saw that video, I'm watching Al Jazeera and I see Wael wheeled into a hospital, his press vest with blood on the side of it, and him wincing in pain as they have to then cut through clothes and figure out what kind of injury he suffered. And he had been hit when he went to a hospital that had been bombed in an Israeli drone strike. And Israel followed up when reporters were there by doing another strike. And Wael got hit with shrapnel. And the entire time when he's on that bed, he's telling them, you need to go back for Samar, his longtime cameraman. And he's saying he's critically wounded. He's bleeding out. We need to send an ambulance back to get him. And so an ambulance tries to go and retrieve him, and the Israelis fire on the ambulance, and they blockade the road. They will not allow anyone to retrieve the body of the main cameraman for Al Jazeera's bureau chief. And Al Jazeera's response to this then was to put a clock on their screen and start a timer of how many minutes had gone by that Israel wasn't allowing any medical personnel to go and retrieve their cameraman. And it went on for more than 5 hours. He struggled to stay alive, and then he bled out and died. This is not collateral damage. This is murder. This is murder of a journalist on television. This is beyond anyone's excuses or justifications. This is murdering journalists to silence them, to take the main network whose cameras have been capturing the war crimes and knock them out, and knock the people operating those cameras out. And you know what? Let's kill multiple generations of their families. If I sound angry, it's because I am. I'm furious. I'm furious at what is happening to the people of Gaza and to my colleagues in Gaza. Sharif, it is unconscionable, the silence that we hear from so many. It's deafening in this country and around the world.
Yeah, I mean, Jazeera is preparing a legal file to submit to the International Criminal Court over what it calls the assassination of Semir. And Reporters Without Borders is also intending to file a lawsuit with the ICC against Israel for targeting journalists in Palestine. I don't think, unfortunately, those are going to go anywhere. And then you're watching the journalists who are still alive, like Wael al-Dahdouh or Mu'taz Azeiza, or these journalists who have become the faces through which we sort of understand of what's happening in Gaza. And I'm really afraid they're going to be killed. Like, I don't know how Wael is alive, actually. He was almost killed. And he keeps going out there and he keeps reporting. He's not leaving. And so, yeah, I mean, what angers me almost more is that, yes, this response by Western news outlets. I'm not talking, they are reporting on what's happening increasingly. There is more reporting on it, and they do report on these journalists being killed. But on the editorial line of it, the democracy dies in darkness or whatever, stuff like that, or the way they responded to Jamal Khashoggi, or the way they responded to Evan Gershkovich, there isn't the same response. And this is so much worse. And so, yeah, it lays bare of a terrifying bias. Often corporate media outlets and journalists, there's this big debate over, whether you're allowed to have a political opinion or not, or objective journalism. And they often label outlets like Democracy Now!, like The Intercept, or independent journalists as activist journalists, as if we have some bias that skews our reporting in a bad way. I can't see a stronger bias than what is being reflected in their coverage. It's just that their bias is framed by establishment orthodoxy. And it spans the political spectrum of Washington, basically. It doesn't fall outside of that. Anything that falls outside of that is radical. But they're the ones who have a radical agenda, I think. That is, if you're just an honest journalist, then you should be outraged. And this should be, the #1 story that you're covering. And I've spoken about this before with you, Jeremy, on Intercepted, about the coverage of places like the New York Times that I'm still somehow shocked by. I'm still somehow shocked. It's gotten better because of the scale of the killing and the length of it. But especially in the beginning, it was just outrageous reporting that on a very basic level of journalism was really handing a microphone to Israel and kind of publishing their narrative without challenging it. So, that's a terrible bias. And then, yeah, what is going to happen to Palestine? What's going to happen to Gaza? They have made it unlivable. Even if the bombing stopped today, if there's a ceasefire at this moment, what's going to happen? The people have nothing to go back to. There is no homes left. They've destroyed it. There's no water. There's no sanitation. They've bombed bakeries. They've bombed wheat mills. I don't know what the plan is. I don't understand. And frankly, I don't think that there is one. a coherent one. You know, there's, you know, Musab, the poet that I just heard talk, he said, "You're not allowed to stay in Gaza. They're driving us out, but you're not allowed to leave it either." And he's like, I don't know what they want. I don't think they know themselves what they're doing. They're just killing and destroying. And I think that is kind of right. Northern Gaza has been turned into this hollow shell. It's an uninhabitable moonscape with few residents left. There's bodies, thousands of bodies or hundreds of bodies buried under the rubble. Southern Gaza is a humanitarian catastrophe with hundreds of thousands of Palestinians crammed into this even smaller space of the strip, displaced in schools and tents and shelters. And there's a relentless bombardment and assault there as well. And can you think of any twin image that is more illustrative of colonial expansion than that? A destroyed and empty geography alongside an overcrowded ocean of displaced suffering. And one can only assume that, you know, this mass slaughter and destruction that Israel has wrought in Gaza suggests an intention to make the territory uninhabitable for the 2.2 or 2.3 million Palestinians who live there, and to push for expulsion via a military engineered humanitarian catastrophe.
Sharif, I wanted to ask you, you know, I'm following the the Palestinian resistance, the armed Palestinian resistance media feeds, which includes videos and statements from a number of factions, not just the Al-Qassam brigades, the armed wing of Hamas, but also includes Palestinian Islamic Jihad and some other factions. And they have a very sophisticated media wing, and they're regularly putting out videos of their attacks against Israeli forces. And they've sort of created this iconic bouncing red triangle that when they show videos, you know, they'll show a tank, they'll rewind it, they'll show you where the forces are, they'll show you the bobbing up and down red triangle, and then they show you a rocket attack on a vehicle. My sense, and I wanted to ask you, because I know you also monitor this, I'm reading the Israeli press, I'm following what the IDF is saying, I'm watching their videos, I'm also following what Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other groups are saying. And it seems pretty clear that there is a tenacious guerrilla war campaign being waged against the Israeli occupation. I think a lot more soldiers have been wounded than Israel is admitting. I think it's pretty clear that there are many more deaths and possibly even prisoners taken among Israeli forces that have not necessarily been disclosed to the public. But the videos, and there are multiple every single day, show that the Palestinian armed resistance against Israel is blowing up a lot of vehicles. There was even one video where they pop up from a tunnel in an Israeli camp where you see Israeli soldiers sitting around and talking. There are hundreds of kilometers of tunnels. And in fact, the IDF released a video that they seized from one of the tunnel sites that showed the construction of the tunnel underneath it. And in some of these tunnels, you can actually drive a car through it. And I mean, this is a very sophisticated underground city, essentially, that Hamas built. And, you know, Israel at the beginning of this capitalized on the ignorance of a lot of people and the fact that people haven't followed these developments closely. There's a reason there are all these networks of tunnels underneath Gaza, and it has everything to do with the kind of campaign that Israel has waged against it. It's regardless of what you think of Hamas or any of these other entities, when you have a governing power that has a nuclear capable country next door that is constantly assassinating not just armed representatives of your armed faction, but political representatives of elected forces, you go underground. I mean, this is all through history. When you ask, why is there Hamas? And I was talking about this the other day on Democracy Now! We can talk about Netanyahu, you know, helping to facilitate funds going to Hamas, but also armed resistance movements grow out of desperation. They grow out of all other tactics being disallowed or banned. And we know that the Palestinians, when they have organized nonviolent demonstrations, as happened throughout 2018 and 2019, not only does Israel fire on the demonstrators, but we know from testimony published by Haaretz that IDF soldiers had a competition to see how many kneecaps they could shoot out of nonviolent protesters to put them in wheelchairs. So what we're seeing is not just, oh, an armed terrorist group is trying to kill as many Jewish people as possible. We are witnessing a guerrilla war campaign against an occupying power. And Israel says that its goal is the elimination of Hamas. I don't see that as possible. I think that this is much bigger than Hamas. This is perceived, and I think rightly so, as a war against the Palestinians for their very survival. And when you strip people of all other means of resistance, all that is left available to you is a violent resistance.
Yeah, and let's step back and see, has Israel achieved any of its military objectives after 2 months of one of the most brutal campaigns in modern history? Something like 22,000 airstrikes in just over 2 months. Have they destroyed Hamas? No, I don't think they're even close. And that is kind of an impossible goal. Hamas has a military wing, yes, it has Al-Qassam, but Hamas has a social wing, a cultural wing, a political wing. It's embedded, it's part of Palestinian society. So to say that you can just destroy Hamas, and they're not even destroying the military wing in this campaign, freeing hostages. Have they freed one hostage through an armed tactic? No, they had to negotiate.
They killed three of their own. They killed three of their own hostages who were waving a white flag. We know that they're gunning down Palestinians left and right, Palestinian civilians, including people that are clearly identifiable as civilians. I mean, I'm sure people have followed this, but three of their own people who were taken hostage, who are speaking Hebrew, have their shirts off and are waving a white flag. Two of them are shot, and then one of them manages to escape the armed forces of his own country, supposedly there to rescue him, and he's calling out in Hebrew, and then he ends up getting shot by another soldier. So they kill three of their own hostages. We know what they're doing to Palestinians, and they did the same thing to three of their hostages.
Yeah,
because they thought they were Arab. They thought they were Palestinians. That's the truth of it.
Yes,
They
and
thought they
Israeli
were
spokesperson is like, why did you shoot them? He's like, well, they were wearing civilian clothing, which is what Hamas operatives have been wearing. He said that's why we shot them. I mean, it's absurd. That story is also very, I think there needs to be some investigation done in it. I don't understand why the IDF, why the Israeli military would admit to this so openly in detail. There's something going on about, I don't know if there's some rift happening between the military and the political leadership or something like that. But to them to admit this in such detail that they're waving white flags, this is a military and a government that has repeatedly lied absurd claims. So I think we have to look into why they admitted the killing of those. But also when you talk about resistance, Palestinians have an internationally recognized right to armed resistance to occupation, first of all. Okay. Secondly, they have a rich history of nonviolent resistance, of civil disobedience that stretches back decades. If you look at the first Intifada, it was an unarmed uprising. This was mostly stone throwing and a lot of civil disobedience and boycotts and strikes and so forth. The response by the Israeli military was to gun people down, and to the stone throwing, an official decree to break their bones, to break their arms. And there's famous videos of Israeli soldiers holding rocks and breaking the arms of young Palestinian boys and men. Then you have, as you pointed out, the Great March of Return, which was started up. It was a grassroots idea, not by Hamas, in Gaza, to have this symbolic act of walking towards the border. Palestinians in Gaza, they're not Gazans. They're not from Gaza, most of them. 80% of them are refugees or their descendants, and they wanted to, and they're mostly from the towns that surround Gaza. And so they had this incredible series, weekly marches towards the border. And the response by the Israeli military was to line up snipers on these mounds of earth. I went there and I witnessed this. And I was there on May 14th when Trump transferred the American embassy in Jerusalem, and that was the most violent day. Over 1,000 people that day were shot, not in like machine gun fire. This was slow and methodical shooting of people. They were just standing there, and a person would get shot with these bullets that would expand on impact, create horrific damage. One doctor told me they're creating a generation of cripples. That's their response to a non-violent or an unarmed action. And so I think Hamas has long maintained its right to have armed resistance. It's a very foundational part of its ethos. It saw what happened with Fatah when it basically laid down its arms, became the PA, recognized Israel, and basically became an outsourced portion of the occupation, and mainly tries to quell Palestinian resistance and protect Israel. And so it says we can't give this up. We can negotiate and we can talk. And Hamas has talked about a state on the 67 borders, but Israel has not complied with that and has not wanted to do that, because every successive Israeli government, all it has done is expand settlements, take more land, dispossess, and exercise control. And to maintain this occupation, to maintain this apartheid state, requires an incredible amount of violence, daily violence, every day. And we were all focused on Gaza, but we all know what's happening in the West Bank, a massive acceleration of violence, of dispossession. Something like, over a dozen Palestinian villages and towns have been depopulated, attacks by settlers. Ben Gvir, the minister, is handing out weapons to settlers. The attacks on Jenin are increasing. They just had, a 3-day siege of Jenin, a stronghold in the north of Gaza, where Shirin Abu Akleh was killed. They raided the Freedom Theater and arrested the director, crashed it, stole equipment and computers and scrawled Hebrew on the walls, and stole books. They destroyed this monument of a horse in Jenin, which was this iconic thing built out of the parts of an ambulance that was destroyed in 2002 in an airstrike. And they built this horse, which was a monument to resistance. They destroyed the street where Shirin Abu Akleh's memorial was, where she was killed. There's an attempt to destroy Palestinian culture, Palestinian society, Palestinian memory in these attacks. And thousands of people are being arrested as well. So it's really a very, very critical moment.
Sharif, we got a bunch of emails from people when we announced this event, and one that really stuck out to me is from Rachel and Mahmoud, who live in the West Bank. And they said that their nephew's teacher was recently murdered at a checkpoint. And I just want to share with people part of what they wrote in their email. They said they understood that the event was in part about the role of the U.S. in how Israel has been conducting the war and the ways in which Biden has delivered conflicting messages in both actions and words. But this is the heart of what they said. I would add that to Palestinians, the actions and rhetoric has always been clearly understood, regardless of which party holds office, that Israel is the agent of the U.S. in the Middle East to protect their unethical interests in the region. The second part, regarding assassination of journalists, has been clear to the Palestinians as a strategy in Israel's playbook from the beginning. This targeting is not limited to journalists. It also includes medical workers, intellectuals, charities, and nonviolent activists, etc. Basically, the best and brightest of society. This also includes vindictive acts that are deadly and those that are bloodless, but deadly in choking the society. It is intended to silence eyewitness accounts and also prevent any other picture of an Arab other than a terrorist from emerging. You're describing also the situation, Sharif, in the West Bank. That's where these folks are writing in from, and we're seeing these raids where not only are people being killed, but you have thousands of Palestinians now who have been taken into prison. And it's so important for people to understand that when, overwhelmingly, when Palestinians are snatched by Israeli forces, including children, because many of the people who are taken when they're kids. In the releases, the exchanges that happened with Hamas in November during this temporary, few days of negotiated cessation of the acute phase of the Israeli campaign against Gaza, we learned about so many of the prisoners, and 2/3 of the 300 names that Israel put up were people that weren't even charged with a crime. And many, many, many of them were people who were either children under the UN definition of it right at this moment, or when they were arrested, they were very clearly children. There were 15-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds. Kids are arrested all the time. And it's not like they're taken to, some juvenile, detention civil court. They're put into a military court system. Israel is the only country in the so-called developed world that is prosecuting children in a military court system. While Gaza is being burned to the ground, you then have open season with basically Israeli government sponsored terrorists who they call settlers that are terrorizing people. And then the Israeli forces are arresting thousands of Palestinians and sticking them into a military justice system, or a military court system, we shouldn't say military justice, where they're also coming out and telling horrifying stories of abuse and other forms of assault inside of Israel's gulag.
Yeah, I mean, and this is not new. There's the Palestinian civil rights, prisoner rights group Ad-Damir has documented this for a very long time, for many years, that Palestinian children are detained. Hundreds of Palestinians are held under what's called administrative detention, where they're not even charged with a crime and don't know why they're being held. And this can be just renewed continuously for months or even years. Part of the reason that this has been allowed to happen and reach this point is because of media coverage. Is it because of the way that this situation is discussed, this occupation is discussed? Palestinians have been saying for a very long time that they live under a system that is apartheid, that preferences one ethnic group over another. You finally had, in the past few years, B'Tselem, the leading Israeli human rights group, come to the conclusion that there is an apartheid system. Then Human Rights Watch, then Amnesty International, and the UN Special Rapporteur also. So this is a system that, from the river to the sea, preferences in different ways people who are Jewish over Palestinians. If you are born in the West Bank, if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel and you marry someone in the West Bank, they can't come live with you. But if a Jewish person in Israel, Jewish citizen of Israel, marries a settler who was born in the West Bank, they can go live with them. That's a very simple law. This is just a law that is in the books. That's the system. Palestinians in the West Bank are subject to military law, but Israeli settlers are subject to civil courts. So I don't think there's any question of this. And there's the coverage of this, it takes a lot for a news outlet to say apartheid or to use these terms. And they're very much couched and just framed in a way that's hedged. Because I don't know, I think they're afraid of upsetting the powers that be, that this is not the official narrative of Washington. But they're very quick to claim that Hamas is a terrorist organization. Fine, the US has designated it that, and so is the EU, and I think it's very fair to report that. That's what the designation is by them, but you don't give the same weight to these other, actually much more neutral observers over what the overall situation is. And this kind of coverage has facilitated this ongoing occupation and the killing in Gaza and everything that we're seeing. And so that's why journalism and press and independent press is so important, actually.
Also, Sharif, the role of propaganda in in this war against Gaza has really been central. And I think, just speaking as an American whose primary responsibility is to hold my own government accountable, we've seen time and again, not just the White House or John Kirby, who basically he has two roles. He appears to be the spokesperson for the National Security Council and often the spokesperson for Israel. His salary is paid by the United States, but in fact, the Israeli press there was a headline in the Israeli newspapers today praising how John Kirby became Israel's best spokesperson. I think was the headline was something to that effect. And it's totally true. It's not The Onion. It is completely true if you watch his press briefings. But, in the case of Al-Shifa Hospital, you and I have talked about this before. They told the world that the U.S. had its own intelligence, that this was this ultra important command and control center that Hamas had underneath Al-Shifa Hospital. And then that clown from the IDF who's doing his best Geraldo Rivera imitation, finding Al Capone's vault, goes down there and they find basically nothing of any note whatsoever. You expect that from the Israelis because they have a very long history of doing this. But when the president of the United States says that the United States has its own intelligence on something, that is really attempting to put a stamp of ultimate or supreme legitimacy on a statement. And that's what the U.S. has done in a number of cases. I did a piece recently about how Joe Biden keeps repeating this claim that he saw all these pictures of babies that were beheaded on October 7th. And I heard it so much that, and I had watched some of the videos of the aftermath of October 7th. I hadn't really drilled down into it. I mean, it was so clear that horrifying, actions were committed, that war crimes were committed on October 7th. But then when you start to look at, at the actual facts, the reporting in the Israeli media, major Hebrew language newspapers have been doing a lot of reporting on what exactly happened on October 7th. And what you discover when you start to actually read the factual, accounting of it, and you start to read the testimony of people, is that there are things that we've been told that have been just sort of, stapled into the narrative that aren't true. And, the White House, the first time Joe Biden said this about seeing pictures of beheaded babies, had to walk it back and say, oh, he didn't actually see photos. He's referring to his, media reports. Well, those media reports have been retracted. The Israeli government no longer makes that assertion, but Biden has continued to say that. But also, we were initially told there were 1,400, civilians that were killed. Well, around 300 of them are soldiers. Hamas attacked a military base. That seems to have been one of the main objectives that day. Definitely attacked the two kibbutzes. They did something that I think is unconscionable, and it's unconscionable when Israel does it too. They took civilians hostage. No one should be kidnapping babies. No one should be kidnapping elderly people. No one should be taking civilians hostage. This is a war crime, and it doesn't matter who does it. The problem is that we focus on it when an entity like Hamas or other Palestinian groups do it, but this is happening regularly to Palestinian families where their children are being snatched and put into a military system. But the point I'm getting at here is that we had, by Israeli counts, there are about 850 civilians that were killed that day. And we all just say Hamas, everyone repeats that Hamas did this. It is important also for, in respect to the dead who died that day in Israel on October 7th, that there be an actual investigation of every aspect of what happened on October 7th. Certainly, Israeli press is going to look at intelligence failures and the reporting about that, but also how did all of their loved ones die? What were the circumstances? More and more we're understanding that when the Israeli military responded to it, they also committed what they're referring to as friendly fire incidents. We don't know how many Israeli civilians died there. But why is this important? Is it important to make some political point? No, it's important because facts matter. Context matters. And often what happens is that the first draft of history that is written on the scene, especially in these kinds of events, a lot of things turn out to not be true. And yet, when the most powerful individuals in the world continue to repeat incredibly incendiary allegations that their own senior advisors are saying, stop saying this because it's not true or it's not verified, then you have to start to ask, why is this happening? With Biden, you could say, oh, he's old, or he's a gaffe machine, or he has a long history of he basically freed Nelson Mandela and he was marching with Martin Luther King. All these things that he has said, that turn out to be completely invented. But that's not an excuse when you're the president of the United States and you're running for re-election. So, the role, though, of propaganda here, Sharif, is very, very intense. And in the moments we have left, I want you to just talk about where you see this headed. You're in Egypt right now. You've spent time at the Rafah crossing. There's been reporting in Egypt and elsewhere that there may be efforts to try to pressure the Egyptian dictator Sisi who just won by almost 90%. You know, it sounds like a real democratic process that just happened there. But to try to either bribe, cajole, blackmail, whatever, Sisi into taking the Palestinians of Gaza into the Sinai. Or, you know, there's been talk of, there was a proposal being shopped around Washington that my colleague Ryan Grimm reported about, that came from some very influential Israelis, about trying to put Palestinians on ships and get them sent as refugees to other countries. Where do you see any aspect of this headed, Sharif?
I mean, look, it's very hard to know. I think what we do know, as I mentioned before, that so much of Gaza has been destroyed. I think the official UN percentage is something like 60 or 70% of the housing has either been completely destroyed or severely damaged. There is, you know, when moments after or hours after October 7th began, Netanyahu went on national television and declared war on Hamas and said to Palestinians in Gaza, leave now. He left unsaid where they're supposed to go. And then a few days into the campaign, they issued that directive telling all the residents of Palestine, all the Palestinian residents in Gaza, to move south of Wadi Gaza, to the southern part of Gaza. And then they put these maps showing the two supposed corridors they're allowed to go down to. And that map really looked like a colonial fantasy, these two arrows pushing away from Palestine and into Egypt. And we have seen millions or hundreds of thousands now crammed into the south, being attacked brutally there. They're attacking Rafah, they're attacking Khan Yunis. These are the places that they were told to go to. And they're starving, literally starving. There's a trickle of aid. Human Rights Watch just put out a report, said that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. At some point, Palestinians may have to leave. I've just heard unconfirmed reports of Palestinians trying to cross the fence and trying to cross the border into Egypt. Maybe that's the plan. Yes, maybe that's the plan to have another mass ethnic cleansing like the Nakba. This is what it seems to be. It's already happening. And to get them into Egypt. Egypt does not want, Sisi and all Arab leaders pay lip service to the Palestinian cause. But Egypt has been complicit in the siege on Gaza for many, many years. Egypt is a close ally of Israel. It even allows Israel to conduct airstrikes in Sinai. It helped, it destroyed the tunnels into Gaza that provided a lifeline to Gaza under the blockade, and it enforced the blockade. So what Egypt doesn't want is hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million or 2 million Palestinians on its territory in Sinai, and then conducting then resistance from their territory into Israel. What happened in Lebanon, what happened in Jordan, especially in the 70s. So, they're pushing back very, very hard on this. And Egypt recently warned that there'll be a rupture in relations with Israel if this happens. I think there's also negotiations of, okay, they can come into Egypt temporarily, but then Europe has to take them or someone has to take them. They can't stay here. I don't know what's going to happen. It's being allowed to happen, primarily because the US is allowing this to happen. What Hamas did on October 7th was to shatter the status quo. That's in the words of Tariq Baqouni, who's an incredible Palestinian thinker and writer and scholar, who wrote a book about Hamas. They did shatter the status quo. We don't know, does that mean that something will fundamentally shift, that there'll be a new push for the Palestinian cause? Does it mean that this is our generation's Nakba and genocide? I don't know, but the killing has to stop immediately. And then we can sit and try and think about how Gaza can be saved or rebuilt, and not by, I'm sure you've seen these, like there's an Israeli, they're like have houses on the beach, like some architectural firm, and put renders of houses in Gaza. So anyway, That's just a long way of saying that it's impossible to tell at this point, but the situation is at a point where you have this humanitarian catastrophe, so it might just force people out in order so they don't die en masse, or at least more than they already have been.
Yeah, and on that note, Sharif, just one final point. I mean, you also see a real line being drawn in the world right now. You know, it's been extraordinary to watch some of these votes at the United Nations because the stakes are much higher. I mean, Israel is constantly being condemned by the General Assembly of the UN going back for years and just ignores every single United Nations resolution. But there is something, the gravity of this situation, I think, is being felt by people the world over. And you see that, you see evidence of that very clearly in the demonstrations that you see in major cities and minor cities all over the world and in every country. But to also have the prime ministers of Spain and Belgium go to Rafah and make the statements that they made, and to have Israeli government officials accusing the United Nations Secretary General of supporting Hamas, accusing members of allied nation governments, including heads of state, of being sympathetic to Hamas, is part of this tapestry of propaganda that Israel has woven, where journalists are Hamas, the United Nations is Hamas, the doctors are all Hamas, the nurses are all Hamas, the children are all Hamas, the entire population is Hamas. And now they're so, in the words of Mouin Rabbani, it's become so irrational that they're even accusing their closest allies of supporting terrorism. I do feel, and this is the last point I'll make, I do feel an earthquake in the world right now. And I don't think things are just going to go back to the way they were. I think that on the issue of Palestine, it is horrifying that it took all of these events, but I think the world is awake in a way that it hasn't been, perhaps ever, to the plight of the Palestinian people. If you wanted to make one last comment, Sharif, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add to that, like, as we've been talking about this mass destruction and unprecedented killing and so forth, and the horrible acts of censorship and blowback to people who speak out about Palestine, I don't think we've ever seen this amount of solidarity and this amount of pro-Palestinian sentiment in the world, but especially in the United States, ever. I went to a massive protest in DC that was the biggest pro-Palestine protest in the US in history. We've seen incredible actions by Jewish Voices for Peace and other groups. And what is noticeable about this movement in solidarity with Palestine is not only that we're seeing this huge generational shift, and I think especially because so many people took part in the George Floyd uprising of 2020, because they can see clearly who is the oppressed and who is the oppressor, who is the colonized and who is the colonizer. But it's also that this is not like an anti-occupation movement. It's anti-Zionist, actually. It is probing into and critiquing the Zionist ideology as a colonial ideology. And we've seen really breathtaking solidarity and protest. And so the US government, and even in polling, it shows that most people in the United States do not support Biden's handling of the war. So they're not even representing, the Biden administration is not even representing its own people in the way it's conducting this. And I think that's very important to understand, that we have seen this massive uprising of solidarity with Palestine that's unprecedented as well.
Sharif, I want to thank you very much for being with us from Cairo. It's very late there, and for people who may not be familiar with Sharif's work, make sure to check out everything he has done, especially the Polk Award-winning documentary on the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, which he did with another incredible journalist who herself is Palestinian American, Layla Al-Arian, our friend and colleague at Al Jazeera. And on that note, Sharif, and thanking you, I hand it back to Annie for a brief closing remark.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy and Sharif, for today's conversation and for all of your work on this critically important topic. And thank you very much to our audience today for being with us. We're grateful for your time. Reader support is critical to our ability to keeping this work going, so please consider making a gift by visiting theintercept.com/Gaza. This reporting is ongoing, and we need your help to fund it as we enter 2024. Thank you again for sharing your time with us.